So, this is where people end up when they can't keep a real corporate job, Evelyn Vance said, letting out a thin, sharp laugh as the heavy glass door of the small metropolitan coffee shop swung shut behind her. The man, standing behind the espresso machine, steam swirling around his white apron, was Ethan Cross. He was the single father she had brutally fired exactly 7 weeks earlier from his role as head of inventory control at Apex Global Distribution. His offense: taking 4 unpaid days off to sit in a sterile hospital room, holding his sick mother's hand. Evelyn remarked almost sweetly that it was nice he had finally found work brewing liquid for someone else. Ethan only offered a calm, unbothered smile. He didn't raise his voice and he didn't correct her. He never once mentioned that he owned this entire building, or that within days the whole country would know his name. Ethan Cross had spent 12 years learning the precise difference between a process that was almost right and a process that was exactly right, and that obsession with precision had never once made him rich. At Apex Global, he ran logistics on a fulfillment floor the size of 3 football fields, walking the loading docks before dawn while the massive transit trucks were still cold, measuring, auditing, and sending back entire freight shipments when a single manifest code was a digit off. Older workers called him careful. The younger, aggressive managers called him slow. Ethan answered to both the exact same way, with a short, quiet nod. He had learned young that being trusted was the only real currency a self-made man could ever count on. He was 36, and he raised himself early every morning in a small, modest rented house on the edge of the city. He made black coffee he rarely had time to finish, and drove an old sedan to a high-stress job he did extraordinarily well, but did not love. What he actually loved lived somewhere underneath all the corporate stress, folded away like an old family recipe card he no longer had the financial nerve to read. Years earlier, Ethan had wanted to roast coffee. He had wanted, more specifically and more foolishly, to own a high-end specialty cafe. A real one, with his own name etched onto the glass and his own signature roasts in the hoppers. He had told almost no one. A dream you never say out loud can never be laughed at. And Ethan had spent a very long time protecting his from corporate laughter. The person who did the laughing at Apex Global Distribution when laughter was required was Evelyn Vance. She had taken over the regional branch young, younger than anyone expected, and she wore her promotion like polished armor she was daring someone to test. To Evelyn, a multi-million-dollar business was a digital spreadsheet that happened to breathe, and every human being inside it was just a number that either climbed or fell. She was not cruel in the theatrical way that made for easy, loud villains. She was worse because she was perfectly efficient. She could end a man's entire livelihood in the time it took to close a laptop lid, and she did it without ever raising her voice. She sincerely believed this calm restraint made her a fair and just executive. Ethan had worked beneath her for 3 long years without ever truly being seen by her. To Evelyn, he was just a line on a report labeled Operations Quality Assurance, reliably green. And green numbers do not require an executive's attention. Ethan preferred it that way. He came in earlier than he was asked to, left later than he was paid for, and assumed, in the plain arithmetic of a decent man, that this ledger of loyalty was being kept somewhere, that it would protect him if the day ever came when he needed protecting. That assumption was the most expensive thing he owned, and he did not know it yet. The flat hum of the hospital corridor became the only clock that mattered for the next 72 hours. My mother, Margaret Cross, lay inside room 412, her breathing slow, regular, and thin, tethered to the world by translucent plastic tubes and the soft rhythmic beep of a cardiac monitor. I sat in a faded vinyl chair that cracked every time I shifted my weight, staring down at a paper cup of lukewarm black coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago. In those long, silent hours of the night, when the rest of the city was asleep, the arithmetic of my life began to shift. At Apex Global Distribution, I had been a machine. I had spent 3 years ensuring that every single shipping pallet, every inventory manifest, and every compliance box was checked to the absolute millimeter. I had missed holidays. I had worked through weekends without putting them on my timesheet because I genuinely believed that my loyalty was a deposit in a bank that would protect me when the winter came. But sitting by that hospital bed watching my mother's pale knuckles rest on the thin white sheets, I realized how incredibly foolish I had been. Evelyn Vance didn't keep a ledger of loyalty. She kept a ledger of numbers, and a line that isn't moving isn't useful to her. My phone vibrated once against my thigh at 8:15 a.m. on Tuesday morning. It wasn't a reply to the detailed medical emergency message I had left for the department. It was an automated corporate email from Human Resources, notifying me that my security clearance had been temporarily suspended due to unexcused operational abandonment during a major internal compliance window. I didn't panic, not yet. I was a quality manager. I dealt with discrepancies for a living. I washed my face in the sterile hospital bathroom, ran my fingers through my uncombed hair, and drove straight back to the corporate headquarters. I still believed that if I sat across from Evelyn, man to man, and showed her the certified hospital admission logs, the plain human truth of the situation would break through her spreadsheet armor. But Evelyn Vance didn't meet me in the quiet privacy of her executive office. When I stepped through the secure glass doors of the operations floor, I found her standing on the raised concrete observation deck overlooking the entire main warehouse transit bay. She was surrounded by my entire team, the 15 shift managers and line supervisors I had personally hired, mentored, and protected from corporate budget cuts over the last 36 months. She held a black leather folio in her hand, her manicured fingers resting on the metal clasp. She didn't look angry. She looked completely unbothered, as though she were reviewing a routine equipment depreciation report. "Ethan," her voice carried effortlessly over the hum of the cooling fans, perfectly calm, crisp, and cold. "Your sudden disappearance over the last 3 days cost this regional hub our premium Tier 1 logistics compliance certification. We were left exposed during an unannounced federal audit window." "Evelyn," I said, my voice tight as I stepped toward the steps, consciously aware of 30 eyes instantly dropping to look at the concrete floor. No one wanted to look me in the eye. My mother had a massive stroke at 4 a.m. on Saturday morning. I left a voice message and sent the digital hospital admission codes directly to HR before dawn. Evelyn didn't even flinch. She simply adjusted her glasses and looked down at her tablet. "Everyone has a reason, Ethan," she said with that slight, polite, completely empty corporate smile. "But reasons don't fulfill logistics contracts with our global suppliers. We build our regional strategy around reliability. A manager who walks off the fulfillment floor the moment personal friction occurs is a liability this department simply cannot afford to carry." "A liability?" I muttered, the word tasting like copper in my mouth. "We need leaders who show up, Ethan. You didn't." She slid a single white termination sheet out of the folio and handed it to the HR representative standing beside her. "Thank you for your years of service. You can collect your personal belongings from your locker before noon." I stood there under the flat, dead hum of the fluorescent lights, listening to the distant, mocking sound of the loading dock alarms. I looked at my supervisors, men who had sat at my kitchen table, men whose families I had helped when their hours were cut. They stared intently at their polished safety boots, terrified that if they spoke a single word of defense, Their own green line on Evelyn's report would turn red. I didn't yell. I didn't slam the folder down. My voice wouldn't have held if I tried. I quietly unclipped my security badge, set it down flat on the cold metal railing of the observation deck, turned around, and walked out through the heavy transit doors. The steel frame clicked shut behind me with a heavy, definitive sound. In less than 5 minutes, I had gone from the top logistics director in the region to an unemployed single man with an empty bank account and a dying mother. And as I stepped out into the blinding glare of the morning sun, I knew one thing with absolute clinical certainty. The corporate world was done with me, and I was entirely on my own. The weeks that followed were the kind of brutal, silent struggle that I would never describe to anyone later, not even when the describing might have won me easy sympathy. My mother's medical bills were not cheap, and the savings I had meticulously built, one careful corporate paycheck at a time, began to drain in a way that made me truly understand the terrifying velocity of financial ruin. I sent out dozens of applications. I sat in cold waiting rooms across from young, unblinking HR managers who held my resume in their hands with a specific, tight expression on their faces. In a town this size, corporate word travels fast, and the word on Ethan Cross, manufactured entirely by Evelyn Vance, was that I was an unreliable manager who had walked out on a high-stakes regional audit when it mattered most. The human truth of a hospital room didn't matter to the corporate cluster. The shape of Evelyn's narrative had already hardened into concrete. I might have taken any low-paying job just to survive. I had almost resigned myself to the long, humiliating crawl of rebuilding my life from the absolute bottom. What stopped me wasn't massive ambition. It was a random Tuesday afternoon and a quiet drive I took for no reason other than to keep moving. I found myself on the faded, forgotten end of Fuller Street. There, nestled between a shuttered dry cleaner and a brick alleyway, stood a small commercial building with faded butcher paper taped over its wide front windows. A crooked sign in the glass read in hand-painted, chipping letters that the place was closing its doors for good. It had been an artisanal coffee house and small-batch bakery once. Stepping closer, I could see the ghost of it through the dusty glass. The long, empty wooden service counter, the cold roaster along the back wall, and a ceramic tile floor worn pale in a specific narrow path behind the counter. It was the exact spot where someone had stood for 30 years, doing the one thing I had always secretly dreamed of doing. I stood on that cracked concrete sidewalk longer than any sensible, unemployed man should have, and the dream I had kept neatly folded away inside my chest for 12 years began very quietly to unfold. I knew every single reason why it was complete madness. I was jobless. My mother was weak in a hospital bed. My remaining savings were a tiny fraction of what they used to be, and what was left was the only thin wall standing between my family and absolute destitution. Buying a dead, failing business at the exact moment my life had completely shattered wasn't a strategic plan. It was the absolute opposite of a plan. Any honest financial advisor would have told me to hide the cash under a mattress, take the first night shift warehouse job that offered a steady check, and let the dream stay buried where it couldn't hurt me. I called the number on the fading sign that same afternoon. The woman who answered, Nora Hale, owned the building. When I met her the next morning, her hands had the permanent, dark-stained creases of someone who had handled coffee beans and hot steel for decades without ever noticing they were there. She didn't try to oversell the space. She walked me through the dim room with a single flashlight because half the old circuit breakers were completely dead. She showed me the heavy commercial espresso machine that still barely functioned, and the twin industrial roasters that did not. She told me plainly what was broken, what would leak, and what would fail within a month. Then she stood in the center of the dusty, empty floor, looked at my tired face, and said, "It's a terrible investment, son. I won't pretend otherwise. But it was a good café. There's a massive difference between a profitable number and a good place. Most corporate people today can't tell the difference." "I can tell the difference," I said quietly. It was the truest thing I had said in years. I took every single dollar I had left. The careful, desperate savings meant to be my final safety net, and I bought the lease and the old equipment. I did the arithmetic a dozen times in my truck, and it never once came out reassuring. When I signed the final legal papers, I sat in the parking lot with my hands gripping the steering wheel for an hour, fully aware that I had just bet the last solid ground beneath my feet on a wild gamble. The first 30 days nearly broke me physically. The cafe on Fuller Street had been dying for a long time, and every morning brought a new financial symptom of that decline. The water pressure fluctuated wildly. The roaster's thermostat lied by 40 degrees depending on its mood, and the front door hung just crooked enough that it scraped the oak frame, announcing every entrance with a sound like a loud complaint. I fixed every single line with my own hands at 2 a.m. because I couldn't afford to pay a real technician. I learned to solder copper pipes. I learned to rebuild heating elements by headlamp. I kept a manic schedule that would have terrified the corporate executives who once called me slow. I was in the cafe by 3 a.m., roasting small test batches in the freezing dark before the temperamental machines came up to heat. I roasted through the dawn, brewed through the heavy day, cleaned through the evening, and repaired through the night. What saved me in the end wasn't a clever marketing campaign or a high-end corporate spreadsheet. It was the product. I turned my lifetime obsession with quality control onto my coffee beans with a focus that bordered on madness. I tested roasting profiles until my hands knew the structural density of a bean purely by feel. I threw away entire batches that were merely good in pursuit of the roast that was absolutely correct. The first few local customers who wandered in out of simple curiosity, fully expecting to confirm the town's rumor that I was an unemployed failure, found instead an espresso with a rich crema that held perfectly and a pour-over that tasted like a beautiful memory rather than a corporate commodity. They came back the next morning, and they brought their colleagues. By the start of the second month, the quiet mornings where I had served only 3 cups were turning into steady lines. The bell over the crooked front door began to ring with a beautiful, constant rhythm. It wasn't wealth yet, but it was survival with the faint, beautiful outline of a future in it. And that was the exact ordinary Thursday when Evelyn Vance casually walked through my door. Lauren Whitmore walked in on an ordinary Thursday, and she did not recognize the place or the man in it, because she had never truly looked at either. She had come to the area on one of the market surveys she conducted personally because she trusted no one else to read a neighborhood the way she believed she could read a spreadsheet. She had parked on Fuller Street by accident, seen a bakery with a modest line of people at the counter, and stepped inside out of a professional habit of examining anything that seemed to be working. She was noting the foot traffic, the price board, the small efficiencies of the room, when the man behind the counter looked up, and her expression changed from assessment to something colder and more pleased. "So, this is where people end up when they can't keep a real job," she said, laughing thinly. It was the same laugh she had used in the open floor at Howren Foods, the one that required an audience to complete it. Ryan recognized her instantly, and something in his chest tightened and then went very still. He was wearing an apron, white with flour. His sleeves were pushed up, and his hands were dusted to the wrist. And he understood in a single clear moment exactly what she was seeing, and exactly what she had decided it meant. She looked him over the way a person looks at a cautionary tale that has arranged itself conveniently for their inspection. She remarked almost sweetly that he had finally found work baking for someone else, adding that it was almost fitting really that a man who could not keep the job she had given him had ended up here. She said it was good that he had found something, using the exact tone people use when they mean the absolute opposite. She was certain, in the way she was certain of most things, that she was looking at the final, pathetic chapter of Ryan Carter's story. Ryan did not correct her. The impulse was there, sharp and immediate, to tell her that the name on the lease was his, that the bread she was standing near was his, and that the small line of people behind her had come for something he had made, not for a paycheck someone had handed him. He held the impulse and let it go. He had spent years being defined by what other people decided about him, and he had learned in the last 2 months that the fastest way to lose was to argue with a conclusion rather than to outlast it. So he served her. He asked in the even voice he used with every customer what she would like, and when she said she was only looking, he nodded and told her she was welcome to look as long as she liked. He treated Lauren Whitmore precisely as he treated everyone who walked through his door, which was with a plain and unbothered courtesy that gave her nothing to push against. And the not pushing seemed to unsettle her more than any defense could have. She lingered a moment longer than she needed to, as though waiting for him to explain himself, to plead his case, or to show her the wound she assumed she had left. When he did none of these things, she gave a small, satisfied shake of her head, the head shake of a person confirming a theory, and she left the way she had come, certain she had seen a man at the bottom of his descent. He never mentioned that he owned this place, or that within days the whole country would know his name. Daniel Brooks came in 11 days later, and unlike Lauren, he was looking, really looking, because looking was his profession. He produced a food program that traveled the country, finding the small places that did one thing extraordinarily well. He ordered without ceremony and ate standing near the window, taking one bite and stopping. He looked at the crust in his hand as though it had spoken to him. Daniel Brooks did not hide his astonishment. He told Ryan that he wanted him on the program, not as a filler segment, but as one of the featured artisan bakeries in an episode that would air nationally. He explained what that kind of exposure would do. Ryan stood very still behind his counter and understood that a door was opening, a different kind of door than the one that had closed on him at Howren Foods, and that this one he was being invited to walk through on the strength of the only thing he had ever wanted to be judged on. He said yes before his fear could talk him out of it. The segment aired 3 weeks later on a Friday night, and it was not long, no more than a few minutes inside a larger episode. But it did the thing Daniel Brooks had spent 15 years driving down county roads in search of. It found the quality that could not be taught and put it in front of the whole country at once. It showed a man with flour on his hands and no training making bread that a professional palate had driven 40 minutes on a rumor to taste. Underneath the food, it told the older and simpler story of a person who had lost everything and refused to stop. The response did not build slowly. It arrived all at once overnight. By the following morning, there was a line outside the crooked door on Fuller Street that ran down the block. Ryan sold out of everything he had by 9 a.m. and baked frantically to sell out again by noon. The bell over the door, which had once gone silent for whole afternoons, now rang so constantly that he stopped hearing it as a sound. The town updated its verdict quickly, and without acknowledging it had ever held the other opinion. The man who had sunk his last dollar into a dying bakery was now the man who had put Fuller Street on the map. The same mouths that had doubted him now claimed cheerfully that they had always known there was something special about that place. Ryan let them. He had learned that outlasting a conclusion meant letting people rewrite their own memories. Lauren Whitmore saw the segment by accident. She was in her apartment on a Friday night when the television cut to a small bakery she recognized. Then the camera found the man behind the counter, his sleeves pushed up and his hands white with flour. It was the same man she had stepped past on Fuller Street, the one whose defeat she had been so certain she had witnessed. And then the program named him not as an employee but as the owner. She sat and watched the rest of the segment without moving. She heard him say he had spent 11 years telling other people when their work was wrong before he ever made anything of his own. She understood with a slow, unpleasant clarity that those 11 years had been spent partly at her company, being reduced to a green line on a report she had never once bothered to read closely. The thing that reached her was that she had been wrong, specifically and publicly, and in a way she could not spreadsheet her way out of. She had fired a man for tending his dying mother and called it reliability. She had stood in his bakery and laughed at him over a defeat he was not experiencing, and he had served her without a word, letting her leave while still believing it. He had not needed to correct her. The truth had simply outlasted her. She went back to Fuller Street on a weekday morning, deliberately early. She stood across the street for a long time, watching people carry white paper bags out of a door she had once swept out of in triumph, and then she made herself cross and go in. Ryan looked up from the counter and he knew her, but whatever he felt did not show. Lauren did not lead with an excuse. She told him she had seen the program and had come to say something she should have said months earlier. She told him she had been wrong to fire him the way she had in front of everyone, and that calling it reliability had been a way of avoiding what it actually was, a decision made by someone who had stopped seeing people as people. "I owed you an apology a long time ago," she said. "I'm sorry for what I decided about you, and for standing in this room and laughing at a man who'd built something I couldn't have built." Ryan let the apology land before he answered. He told her evenly that he accepted it. He was not a man who collected grievances, but he did not let her leave with a tidy, redemptive story in which her cruelty had accidentally been a gift. He told her plainly that his success had not come from being fired. He said that losing his job had not been a hidden blessing, that it had nearly destroyed him and his mother both, and that if the story she took from this was that her decision had done him some kind of good, then she had learned the wrong lesson again. What had built the bakery was not the door she closed. It was that he had refused to stop after she closed it. Lauren took that truth quietly and with a changed face. She bought a loaf before she left, paid for it like everyone else, and the bell rang over her as she went out into the ordinary morning. She went back to her company and to the floor she had never truly walked, and she began slowly, against every habit she had built her whole career on, to read the reports differently. She started asking who the green lines were, learning the names attached to the numbers and the circumstances behind the absences. And when someone came to her one afternoon needing a few days for a family emergency, she recognized the shape of the moment she had gotten catastrophically wrong once before. And she did not get it wrong again. Margaret Carter recovered enough to keep her promise, which was to be well enough to taste it. Ryan drove her to Fuller Street on a slow Sunday, stood her in the middle of the floor, and watched his mother eat the bread her son had bet everything to make. And he understood that the arithmetic that had never once come out reassuring had somehow, against every number, come out right. Sometimes the door another person closes in your face is the very thing that forces you to build the one that was always meant to be yours. Lasting success does not come from other people's recognition, and it does not come from the moment your worst enemy is proven wrong. It comes from the plain, unglamorous courage to chase the thing you love, and from the harder courage to stand back up, one sleepless night at a time, after everything you had has been taken away.